The early morning sun, soft and golden, spilled across the wide porch of Briarwood House, warming the worn planks, where Eleanor Vance cradled her favorite mug. Steam rose from the coffee, mingling with the sweet, pervasive scent of lilac bushes. Bushes her grandmother had planted nearly 70 years ago, their gnarled branches now heavy with fragrant purple blooms. Briarwood wasn't just a house. It was a living repository of memory, 3 generations held within its sturdy walls under the distinctive roofline, trimmed in what her family had always called heritage blue. It was a shade of deep, resilient history, a stark contrast to the bland beiges increasingly favored in the rapidly changing Willow Creek Estates neighborhood. This quiet moment, the scent of lilacs and coffee, the familiar weight of the old house settling around her, this was Eleanor's sanctuary. The peace was shattered not by a sound, but by a presence. A sleek, aggressively modern SUV pulled silently to the curb, and out stepped Victoria Sterling, dressed in sharp, expensive athletic wear that looked like it had never seen a bead of sweat. Victoria moved with an air of crisp authority that always set Eleanor's teeth on edge. She strode purposefully up the walkway, her heels clicking an unnerving rhythm on the flagstones, stopping just short of the porch steps. Her smile was bright, fixed and utterly devoid of warmth. In her hand she held a thick, glossy envelope. "Eleanor, good morning," Victoria chirped, the forced cheeriness grating. "Just wanted to personally deliver this exciting opportunity." She held out the envelope as if bestowing a royal decree. Eleanor took it, her fingers brushing the expensive cardstock. Inside, nestled amongst professionally printed brochures, showcasing identical soulless houses with matching mailboxes, was a formal invitation to join the newly incorporated Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. The glossy paper felt cold, alien. "Opportunity," Eleanor echoed, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "Absolutely." Victoria beamed, though her eyes remained coolly assessing, sweeping over Briarwood's facade with faint disapproval. "We're standardizing the neighborhood aesthetic to protect and enhance property values for everyone. Membership is vital for community cohesion." She paused for effect. "The initial membership fee is just $5,000, with monthly dues of $350. Eleanor felt a familiar tightening in her stomach, a knot of resistance. It wasn't just the exorbitant cost. Tucked behind the main brochure was a list titled Mandatory Property Harmonization Guidelines. Her eyes scanned the points, each one feeling like a small stab. Repaint all non-approved exterior trim colors. Ref approved palette. Beige variants. AD. Goodbye. Heritage. Blue. Remove non-compliant legacy plantings, exceeding height, spread regulations, or deemed aesthetically inconsistent. The lilacs, her grandmother's lilacs. Eliminate audible exterior hangings, wind chimes, etc. The antique chimes whose gentle melody lulled her to sleep each night. Before Eleanor could formulate a response, Victoria had her phone out, angling it to capture images of Briarwood's front yard, lingering pointedly on the vibrant blue trim and the sprawling lilac bushes. "Just documenting the current landscape for the HOA Architectural Committee files," Victoria stated smoothly, though it felt like a violation, an act of surveillance under the guise of neighborhood pressure. The air moments before filled with the scent of history and peace now felt thick with tension, and the unwelcome promise of conflict. This wasn't an invitation. It felt like the opening salvo in a war. Eleanor never wanted to fight a fight for the very soul of her historic home. Later that afternoon, after the unsettling encounter had cast a pall over her day, Eleanor retrieved a carefully preserved copy of Briarwood House's original deed from her grandfather's old mahogany desk. The parchment was thick, the ink slightly faded but undeniably clear, documenting the property's establishment, long before Willow Creek Estates was even a developer's dream, let alone saddled with a restrictive HOA. Armed with this tangible piece of history, she walked across the manicured lawn, separating her property from Victoria Sterling's imposing modern structure. She found Victoria overseeing landscapers meticulously arranging identical dwarf shrubs along her walkway. Victoria turned as Eleanor approached, her smile tightening almost imperceptibly. "Eleanor, can I help you?" "Victoria, I reviewed the documents you provided." Eleanor began, her voice steady. Despite the unease churning within her, she held out the copy of the deed. "I wanted to bring this to your attention. As you can see, Briarwood House predates the formation of Willow Creek Estates and any subsequent HOA agreements by several decades. Legally, my property is not bound by these new covenants. She kept her explanation concise, purely factual. Victoria glanced at the document with performative interest, her perfectly manicured fingers barely brushing the paper. "Oh, that's interesting," she said, her tone dismissive. "A historical artifact, I suppose. But, Eleanor, things change. Progress happens. We're building a cohesive community here, and frankly, outlier properties negatively impact everyone's investment." She waved a hand vaguely towards Briarwood House, as if its unique character were a contagious disease. Just then, the front door of the Sterling residence opened, and Mark Sterling stepped out onto the porch. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the quiet, watchful stillness of someone accustomed to authority. The former police chief of nearby Port City, now enjoying a lucrative security consultancy retirement. He didn't speak, merely leaned against a pillar, arms crossed, his gaze fixed unwaveringly on Eleanor. His silence was more unnerving than any shouted word. It felt like a physical weight, an unspoken threat reinforcing his wife's position. Victoria seemed emboldened by his presence. "Look," she continued, dropping the last pretense of friendliness, her voice hardening slightly. "This isn't really optional. When one house doesn't conform, it brings down the entire street. We have standards. And there can be consequences for properties that consistently fail to meet community expectations. Fines, liens, things can get complicated. Accidents happen to older homes, wiring, plumbing. It would be a shame if something unfortunate occurred because of outdated systems." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Eleanor felt a distinct chill, the first real shiver of fear mixed with rising anger. This wasn't about beige paint or lilac bushes. It was about control, about power wielded under the guise of neighborhood betterment. She met Victoria's gaze directly, refusing to be intimidated by her words or her husband's silent menace. "Thank you for clarifying your position, Victoria," Eleanor said, her voice low but firm. She retracted the copy of the deed. "Mine remains unchanged. Briarwood House will not be joining your association, nor will it be altered according to these guidelines." She turned, feeling Mark Sterling's eyes follow her every step back across the lawn. The lines of battle now clearly, irrevocably drawn in ink and unspoken threats. The first official notice arrived a week later, slipped under her door rather than mailed. It was printed on heavy HOA letterhead, citing a violation. Presence of non-approved decorative lawn ornamentation. Eleanor frowned, scanning her yard. The only object remotely fitting that description was a weathered stone garden gnome tucked away near the old oak tree, a whimsical gift from her late nephew years ago. It had sat there unnoticed for a decade. The accompanying fine was a stinging 150 annoyance ward with a grim understanding. This wasn't about a gnome. It was about finding leverage, however petty. Eleanor photographed the notice, the gnome in its place, and filed everything meticulously in a new folder labeled HOA Correspondence. The following Tuesday, during an important video conference call for her work as a freelance historical researcher, a deafening roar erupted outside her home office window. A commercial-grade leaf blower wielded by a landscaper she didn't recognize blasted debris directly towards her side of the property line. The noise was intolerable, forcing her to apologize profusely and cut the call short. When she went outside, the landscaper merely shrugged, pointing vaguely down the street and saying something about emergency cleanup for the HOA. Yet no other part of the street seemed to require such urgent high-decibel attention. This pattern repeated twice more over the next 10 days, always during peak work hours, always justified with flimsy excuses. Each incident was carefully logged, date, time, duration, description, photographs of the suspiciously localized emergency. Eleanor's patience frayed, but her resolve to document hardened. Then came the weeds, not the usual springtime crabgrass, but thick, stubborn clusters of bindweed and thistle, appearing almost overnight along the edge of her property, suspiciously close to her cherished rose bushes and the area where the lilacs had once thrived. It looked deliberately scattered, not naturally occurring. Elsewhere in Willow Creek Estates, the lawns remained impeccably uniform. Tended by Victoria's approved landscaping crews, Eleanor spent hours painstakingly pulling the invasive plants, her hands sore, her mind connecting the dots. These weren't isolated incidents. This was a deliberate, orchestrated campaign of petty harassment, designed to wear her down, to make maintaining Briarwood House an exhausting, expensive ordeal. Victoria, when seen, offered only saccharine smiles and feigned ignorance. "Oh dear, weeds already, terrible season for them," she'd offered brightly one morning, watching Eleanor wrestle with a particularly stubborn thistle root near the sidewalk. The insincerity was galling. That evening, Eleanor sat at her grandfather's desk, reviewing her growing file of documented incidents. The gnome, the targeted noise disruptions, the insidious weeds. It painted a clear picture of escalating pressure. Victoria wasn't just trying to persuade her, she was trying to punish her into compliance. A cold suspicion settled in Eleanor's gut. If Victoria was willing to engage in this kind of petty warfare, what else might she be capable of? The thought spurred her to action. This systematic annoyance, this deliberate psychological needling needed more than just written logs. The next day, Frank Rourke, the discreet private investigator she occasionally consulted for complex historical research verification, arrived under the guise of discussing an old land grant query. Following Eleanor's detailed instructions, he expertly installed several small high-definition security cameras around Briarwood House. They were weatherproof, equipped with night vision, and cleverly concealed within architectural details and dense foliage covering all approaches to the house and key areas of the yard. It felt like a significant unsettling step, transforming her beloved home into a fortress under surveillance. But as Frank packed up his tools, leaving no trace, Eleanor felt a grim sense of preparedness. The campaign of annoyance had forced her hand. Now she wouldn't just be enduring it, she'd be watching. It was well past midnight when Eleanor, unable to shake a persistent feeling of unease, decided to review the security footage from the past few hours. She sat in the dimly lit study, the glow of the monitor casting long shadows across the room, clicking through the recordings from the camera, positioned near the heritage lilac bushes. The timestamp showed 1:17 a.m. The screen flickered, and then she saw them. 3 figures moving stealthily under the cover of darkness, illuminated intermittently by the weak moonlight. Filtering through the trees, Eleanor leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat. The figures were unmistakable. Victoria Sterling dressed in dark clothing, her husband Mark, his large frame easily identifiable, and another man Eleanor vaguely recognized from HOA meetings. They carried backpack sprayers, the kind used for pesticides or herbicides. The footage was chillingly clear as they moved directly to the base of the ancient lilac bushes. Her grandmother's lilacs, the ones Victoria had demanded she remove, deliberately, they aimed the nozzles low, soaking the soil around the root systems and the base of the woody stems. They worked quickly, efficiently, like a practiced team, casting furtive glances toward the street, before retreating back towards the Sterling property line, as silently as they had appeared. A cold fury mixed with a profound sense of violation washed over Eleanor. This wasn't just property damage, it was a desecration. Those lilacs were more than plants. They were living connections to her past, to the grandmother who had taught her to garden. In that very spot, watching the footage felt like witnessing an assault on memory itself. She saved the recording, making multiple secure backups, her hands trembling slightly, not with fear, but with controlled rage. The next morning, Eleanor approached Victoria, who was directing her landscapers near the shared property line. Eleanor kept her voice level, betraying none of the turmoil she felt. "Victoria, I need to talk to you about my lilac bushes." Victoria turned, arranging her features into an expression of mild concern. "Oh, is something wrong, Eleanor? They haven't looked particularly healthy lately, have they?" "They looked perfectly healthy yesterday," Eleanor stated flatly. "This morning the leaves are already showing signs of distress, and there's a chemical smell near the roots." Victoria put a hand to her chest in a gesture of exaggerated sympathy. "Oh dear, that sounds worrying. Perhaps it's some sort of aggressive blight, or maybe root rot. These older plantings can be so susceptible." The HOA is actually quite concerned about diseased plants potentially spreading. Before Eleanor could respond, Mark Sterling emerged from their house and walked purposefully towards them, stopping beside his wife. He didn't smile. His presence was instantly imposing, a silent physical warning. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly, his eyes fixed on Eleanor. "Eleanor is concerned about her bushes," Victoria said, looking up at her husband with a helpless air that Eleanor knew was entirely false. Mark's gaze remained on Eleanor. "Sometimes," he said slowly, his voice carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of menace. "It's best to just remove problematic things before they cause bigger issues for everyone. Trying to hold on to things past their prime, it rarely ends well." The implication was clear. He wasn't just talking about plants. Eleanor met his hard stare, refusing to look away. The anger inside her burned hotter, but she clenched her jaw, reminding herself of the crystal-clear footage stored safely away. Revealing her hand now would be premature. "Thank you for your assessment, Mark," she said tightly. "I'll handle my own property." She turned and walked back towards Briarwood House, the image of the midnight assault seared into her mind. The violation felt intensely personal, cutting deeper than any fine or petty annoyance. Victoria and Mark had crossed a line, escalating their campaign from harassment to outright malicious destruction. And they had no idea she had watched it all. Within days, the vibrant life drained from the heritage lilac bushes. The leaves curled inwards, turned a sickly brown, and began to drop, carpeting the ground beneath the brittle branches. The sweet fragrance that had always defined Briarwood's spring mornings was gone, replaced by a faint lingering chemical taint near the soil. Seeing the withered remains each day was a fresh stab of grief for Eleanor. It felt like losing another piece of her grandmother, another tangible link to the past. Willfully destroyed, the quiet sadness coalesced into a cold, hard knot of determination. Documenting Victoria's petty campaign was no longer enough. This deliberate destruction demanded a more proactive response. Eleanor made a call she hadn't expected to make regarding her home life. Frank Rourke, the ex-detective turned private investigator, whose sharp mind she'd relied on occasionally to verify obscure details in complex historical cases, listened patiently on the other end of the line. She didn't reveal her suspicions about the specific culprits, yet framing it, instead, as escalating targeted harassment potentially aimed at devaluing her property, mentioning the suspicious pattern of disruptions and the final act of vandalism against the lilacs. "Frank," she said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion, "I need more than just my own notes. I need someone to look into the background here discreetly. Something feels fundamentally wrong in Willow Creek." If Frank, ever the professional, and sensing the gravity beneath her, measured words, agreed without hesitation. He began where Eleanor couldn't easily tread, the labyrinthine corridors of the county records office and online databases. Within a week, he reported back with findings that sent a fresh wave of dread through Eleanor. "There's a pattern, Eleanor," he confirmed, his voice grim over the phone. "Over the past 2 years, 3 other properties in your immediate vicinity, whose owners initially resisted the HOA, faced a sudden spate of mysterious issues. Unexpected code violations citing structural concerns, anonymous complaints about neglected upkeep, even one small contained electrical fire ruled accidental. In each case, the pressure mounted until the owners sold. Sold to whom? Eleanor asked, already suspecting the answer. All 3 were bought significantly under market value by the same LLC, Frank replied. Sterling Development Group registered agent, a law firm known to handle Victoria Sterling's business affairs. The connection solidified Eleanor's worst fears. This wasn't just neighborhood tyranny, it was potentially a coordinated scheme to acquire property through intimidation and sabotage. As Frank continued digging into Sterling Development Group's financials and connections, Eleanor kept a vigilant eye on her security feeds. Her vigilance paid off one evening. The cameras captured 2 men known HOA allies, often seen with the Sterlings loitering near her property line under the guise of inspecting the sidewalk, but their actions were far from innocent. One meticulously photographed the historic wooden fence posts, even subtly testing their stability, while the other angled his phone camera directly at the utility access points on the side of Briarwood House, the electrical meter, the gas line intake, the main water shutoff valve. They weren't just looking for aesthetic flaws anymore. They were documenting vulnerabilities, cataloging potential points of failure. The sight filled Eleanor with a chilling premonition. The withered lilacs were just the beginning. The growing dread intensified, whispering that Victoria Sterling's plans for Briarwood House might involve something far more destructive than just unwelcome changes to its heritage charm. Eleanor was deeply engrossed in deciphering a complex passage from a 17th century mariner's log. For a maritime museum client, the silence of her temporary workspace miles away from Willow Creek, punctuated only by the soft click of her keyboard. Her phone buzzed insistently beside her laptop. Annoyed at the interruption, she glanced at the caller ID. Agnes Holloway, her elderly neighbor. A prickle of unease went through her as she answered. "Eleanor, oh, Eleanor, thank God I reached you." Agnes's voice was thin, panicked. "It's Briarwood, oh dear Lord, it's on fire." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Disbelief warred with a sudden sickening certainty. Fire. Agnes, what are you saying? Flames everywhere. The fire department is here, but it's bad. Eleanor, really bad. You need to come home. The world seemed to tilt. Eleanor mumbled a response, her mind racing, hands fumbling as she slammed her laptop shut and grabbed her keys. The drive back to Willow Creek Estates was a blur of flashing lights, merging with distorted memories. Baking cookies with her grandmother in the now incinerating kitchen reading. By the fireplace in the living room that was likely collapsing into embers, the scent of lilacs from the porch, now choked by acrid smoke. This couldn't be happening. She arrived to a scene of controlled chaos and utter horror. Bright orange flames licked greedily at the iconic heritage blue trim, black smoke billowed into the twilight sky, and the air crackled with heat. And the roar of the inferno. Firefighters swarmed the property, hoses snaking across the lawn, shouting instructions over the wail of sirens. Briarwood House, her sanctuary. Her history was being consumed before her eyes. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face, hot and stinging, blurring the devastating scene. Through the haze of smoke and flashing emergency lights, she spotted a figure standing calmly on the perfectly manicured lawn across the street near the Sterling residence. It was Victoria. She held a delicate porcelain coffee cup, sipping from it occasionally, as she watched the destruction unfold with an unnerving, almost serene detachment. There was no shock on her face, no sympathy, only a cool, appraising observation that turned Eleanor's blood cold. Fire Chief Miller, his face grimed with soot, approached Eleanor gently. Ms. Vance, I'm so sorry. We're doing everything we can, but it had a significant head start. He paused, shaking his head. Looks like it might have started in the attic or near the main electrical panel. These old houses, the wiring can be unpredictable. Unpredictable, Eleanor choked out the word, the image of the men photographing her utility boxes flashing in her mind. Chief, I had a full electrical inspection less than 3 months ago. Everything was up to code, certified. Chief Miller looked surprised but nodded slowly. Okay, noted. We'll investigate thoroughly once it's safe, of course, but right now our focus is containment. A sudden desperate thought struck Eleanor. The cameras, Frank's cameras, her hands shaking, she pulled out her phone trying to access the live feed or recent recordings. The app spun, then displayed an error message. System offline, last recording, 2:47 a.m. Hours before the fire likely started. It wasn't a malfunction. The timing was too precise, too convenient. They hadn't just targeted her home. They had blinded her first. The realization hit with the force of certainty. This was no accident. This was arson. Later, as the exhausted firefighters began dampening down the smoldering ruins, Frank Rourke arrived, his face etched with concern. While Eleanor stood numbly watching the skeletal remains of her life steam in the night air, Frank quietly circled the perimeter, his trained eyes scanning the debris near the foundation away from the main water spray. He knelt, carefully examining something near where the old porch steps had been, using a small evidence bag from his kit to collect a sample of soil and charred wood that seemed oddly discolored, emitting a faint non-woodsy chemical odor, almost masked by the smoke and water. Might be nothing after all this water, he murmured, meeting Eleanor's grief-stricken gaze. But maybe, just maybe, it's something. The physical loss was immense, a crushing weight of history, turned to ash. But seeing Victoria's cold satisfaction, knowing the cameras were deliberately disabled, hearing Frank's cautious finding, it forged something new within Eleanor's despair. Grief mingled with a burning righteous fury. They hadn't just destroyed her home, they had underestimated her. The inferno hadn't broken her, it had ignited an unshakable resolve for justice. In the days following the fire, as Eleanor navigated the painful bureaucracy of insurance claims and temporary housing, Victoria Sterling wasted no time orchestrating a subtle whisper campaign throughout Willow Creek Estates. Carefully worded concerns about the speed of the blaze veiled suggestions about Eleanor's financial state before the fire, and pitying comments about how desperate people sometimes get began circulating. Victoria positioned herself as the concerned community leader, publicly lamenting the tragedy while privately planting seeds of doubt about Eleanor effectively attempting insurance fraud, character assassination. Eleanor heard the rumors indirectly through Agnes Holloway, whose initial fear had turned into quiet, fierce loyalty after witnessing the fire, and Victoria's chillingly calm reaction. The rumors stung, but Eleanor pushed the hurt aside, focusing instead on the cold, hard facts she knew to be true. Sitting in the impersonal quiet of her temporary apartment, surrounded by salvaged, most damaged belongings, Eleanor made a secure call. Not as a grieving homeowner, but drawing on a network forged over years in a different, more demanding professional life. She reached out to Agent Miller, an FBI contact within the Public Corruption Unit, whom she trusted implicitly from past collaborations. Without revealing her current judicial position, she outlined the escalating harassment, the suspicious pattern Frank Rourke had uncovered regarding property sales, the deliberate disabling of her security system, and the convenient accidental nature of the fire that destroyed her historically significant home. "Agent Miller," she said, her voice low and steady, "I believe this goes far beyond HOA disputes. There's a pattern of coercion and potential organized criminal activity here that warrants federal attention." Miller, recognizing the gravity in her tone and trusting her judgment, promised to look into it discreetly. The breakthrough came unexpectedly a few days later. A heavily encrypted email arrived in Frank Rourke's inbox from an anonymous source requesting a secure, untraceable meeting. After careful vetting, Frank met the contact in a bustling, noisy food court miles away. A pale, visibly terrified woman who introduced herself as Isabel Moreno, Victoria Sterling's former bookkeeper. Her hands trembled as she slid a small USB drive across the table. She made me move the money," Isabel whispered, darting nervous glances around. After each incident, funds went from Sterling Development Group to offshore accounts, then back as consulting fees. And Mark, he made calls. Things just disappeared from police records. Old complaints, preliminary fire reports from the other houses, gone. She explained she'd quit weeks ago, fearing she was becoming too deeply implicated, and had copied incriminating files before wiping her work computer. "She threatened me," Isabel added, her voice barely audible. "Said people who talk too much have accidents." Back in the relative safety of his own office, Frank analyzed the contents of the drive. It was a goldmine. Detailed spreadsheets tracked cash flows, aligning perfectly with the dates of the previous suspicious fires and subsequent property acquisitions by Sterling Development Group. Scanned internal memos hinted at Mark Sterling's influence, referencing specific case numbers that suddenly went cold. It painted a damning picture of financial fraud linked directly to the pattern of destruction. Simultaneously, Frank meticulously reviewed the security footage Eleanor had managed to preserve from the hours before her system was disabled on the night of the fire. There, captured clearly by a camera angled towards the Sterling's driveway, was footage from 2 evenings prior. It showed Victoria and Mark Sterling engaged in an animated discussion with a third man, Arthur Kensington, a notoriously aggressive property developer known for pushing controversial high-density projects through resistant communities. They huddled together under the porch light, pointing towards Briarwood House, their expressions intense. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't just Victoria's personal vendetta or a simple land grab. It involved powerful players, financial manipulation, official corruption, and potentially serial arson. The conspiracy network was far larger and far more dangerous than Eleanor had initially imagined. Frank Rourke's next call to Eleanor crackled with suppressed excitement. "I found it, Eleanor," he said, his voice low but intense. "The final piece of the why. Deep in the city planning archives, filed under a vague infrastructure improvement proposal, is a plan for major road realignment and rezoning affecting the entire Willow Creek boundary. And guess whose property sits squarely at the intersection, making it the essential linchpin for Arthur Kensington's proposed luxury condo complex? Mine." Eleanor breathed, the cold realization settling over her. Briarwood wasn't just an eyesore to Victoria, it was a multi-million-dollar roadblock. Kensington likely couldn't proceed without acquiring her land, and Victoria using the HOA as her weapon, and Mark's influence as her shield, was his brutal instrument for clearing the path. The immense pressure, the escalating harassment, the arson, it all snapped into sharp, horrifying focus. Armed with this definitive motive and Isabel Moreno's financial evidence, Eleanor briefed FBI agent Miller again. The pattern of racketeering, corruption, and dangerous escalation was undeniable. Miller, recognizing the imminent danger Isabel might be in and the need for incontrovertible proof, proposed a high-risk, high-reward strategy, wiring Isabel for one final meeting with Victoria Isabel. Moreno was terrified, her face ashen, when Frank and Agent Miller laid out the plan. The thought of confronting Victoria knowing the woman was capable of arson, and likely worse, made her physically ill. Yet the memory of Victoria's casual threats, combined with the knowledge of the devastation, caused to Eleanor and potentially others, strengthened her resolve. Clutching a hidden recording device expertly concealed by an FBI technician, Isabel agreed, her voice trembling but firm. "She needs to be stopped," she whispered, "before she hurts someone else." The meeting took place at an upscale cafe far from Willow Creek, chosen by Victoria. Isabel played her part convincingly, feigning continued fear and hinting she might need financial help to stay quiet. Victoria, radiating smug confidence, took the bait. The hidden microphone captured every chilling word. "Relax, Isabel," Victoria purred, stirring her latte dismissively. "Everything is under control. The Briarwood situation, unfortunate but necessary. Kensington's project is moving forward now. Mark handled the initial fire report just like the others, clean. No loose ends." Isabel, following the FBI's coaching, pressed gently. "But what if something links back? People talk." Victoria leaned forward, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper, the cafe's background noise failing to mask the menace. "Let me be perfectly clear. You received your final severance. Keep your mouth shut, disappear, and you'll be fine. Start talking. Well, let's just say flammable liquids aren't the only way houses, or people, have accidents. Understand." The recording was perfect, chillingly clear. Victoria hadn't just confirmed the arson. She'd bragged about Mark's role in the cover-up and issued a direct, unambiguous threat against Isabel. Back at the temporary FBI command post, listening to the playback, Eleanor felt a grim satisfaction mingling with her disgust. They had it all. The motive. Kensington's lucrative development deal blocked only by Briarwood House. The means arson facilitated by Mark Sterling's official influence to suppress investigations and potentially tamper with evidence. The opportunity Victoria's absolute power within the HOA used to harass, intimidate, and ultimately justify targeting non-compliant properties. The full picture of the Sterling conspiracy network was laid bare, undeniable, and ready for exposure. The time for quiet investigation was over. The time for judgment was rapidly approaching. Victoria Sterling convened the emergency HOA meeting with practiced efficiency, transforming the sterile community clubhouse into her personal courtroom. She stood behind a lectern bathed in the unflattering fluorescent light, radiating an air of concerned authority. Most of the homeowners sat in arranged chairs, some looking uncomfortable, others nodding along dutifully as Victoria began. Agnes Holloway caught Eleanor's eye briefly from across the room, offering a small, worried nod before quickly looking away. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Victoria began, her voice smooth and modulated. "As you know, our community prides itself on maintaining exceptional standards, which directly impacts our property values." Her gaze swept the room before landing with faux sympathy on the empty space representing Eleanor's presence. Unfortunately, the recent tragic fire at the Vance property, while deeply saddening, has left us with an unsightly and potentially hazardous situation. She clicked a remote, and an unflattering photo of the charred Briarwood ruins appeared on the projection screen behind her. "This piece's condition negatively affects us all. Therefore, the HOA board proposes an emergency neighborhood revitalization assessment to fund the immediate clearing and securing of the lot." She named a significant sum, adding smoothly, "This ensures the burden doesn't fall solely on one homeowner during their time of difficulty and protects our collective investment." It was a masterful spin, framing extortion as community support. Just as Victoria was about to move to a vote, the double doors at the back of the room opened quietly. Eleanor Vance walked in. She wasn't dressed in mourning, nor did she look defeated. Clad in sharply tailored slacks and a crisp blouse, she carried an air of quiet composure that instantly drew all eyes. She carried a slim laptop bag. "Excuse me, Victoria," Eleanor said, her voice calm but clear, cutting through the room's expectant silence. "Before you proceed, I believe there's some relevant information the homeowners should consider." Victoria's perfectly sculpted smile faltered for a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. "Eleanor, we weren't expecting, well, this is an HOA matter regarding the current state of the property." "Precisely," Eleanor agreed coolly. "And understanding how we arrived at this current state seems pertinent. Without waiting for permission, she walked to the side table, opened her bag, and swiftly connected her laptop to the projector Victoria had been using. The image of the Briarwood ruins vanished, replaced by Eleanor's desktop background. With a few clicks, a video file began to play. The grainy night vision footage filled the screen. Victoria Mark Sterling and another man clearly visible methodically, spraying the base of Eleanor's thriving lilac bushes. Gasps rippled through the room. People shifted uncomfortably, murmuring amongst themselves, glancing nervously between the screen and a suddenly rigid Victoria. This footage, Eleanor narrated calmly, pausing the video on a clear shot of Victoria aiming the sprayer, was taken several weeks before the fire. It documents the deliberate destruction of heritage plantings on my property. Before Victoria could formulate a response, Eleanor clicked again. A series of still photographs appeared, close-ups of the HOA allies photographing her fence posts, then clear shots of them aiming cameras directly at her electrical meter and gas intake valve. And this, Eleanor continued, shows individuals associated with the HOA documenting utility access points just days before the fire, which according to the initial assessment may have originated near the main electrical panel. One final click brought up a simplified flowchart graphic showing dates of previous accidental fires at non-compliant homes immediately followed by property acquisitions by Sterling Development Group. And this, Eleanor stated, suggests a rather alarming pattern connecting mysterious property damage with financial gain for an entity closely linked to our HOA president. Victoria finally found her voice laced with indignation. "This is outrageous, preposterous," she sputtered, stepping forward. "This evidence is circumstantial, likely doctored. Eleanor is clearly distraught and lashing out, trying to deflect blame." Eleanor simply met her furious gaze, letting the images on the screen hang heavy in the tense silence of the room. "There's more, Victoria," she said quietly, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Victoria's rising agitation. "Much more." The trap was sprung, and Victoria Sterling for the first time looked visibly rattled. "This is nothing more than a desperate attempt to smear my reputation," Victoria declared, her voice rising, regaining some of her characteristic bluster. She turned towards the homeowners, attempting to reclaim control of the narrative. "Ms. Vance is clearly overwrought by her loss and is fabricating connections where none exist. This meeting is about addressing the blight on our street, not indulging these wild conspiracy theories." She gestured dismissively towards the projector screen, as if waving away the damning images. "Now, if we can return to the matter at hand, the assessment vote." "Actually, Victoria," Eleanor interrupted, her voice cutting through Victoria's attempted deflection with quiet authority. "We haven't quite finished with the evidence." She reached down into the laptop bag she'd placed beside the table. The room watched hushed as she withdrew not another file but a folded garment of heavy black silk. With deliberate, unhurried movements, Eleanor unfolded it. The murmuring in the room died instantly as the unmistakable form of judicial robes became apparent before the stunned eyes of her neighbors and a suddenly frozen Victoria Sterling. Eleanor Vance slipped the robes on over her blouse and slacks. The transformation was immediate and profound. The quiet homeowner vanished, replaced by the imposing figure of judicial authority. She stood taller, her gaze sweeping the room before settling firmly on Victoria. "Victoria Sterling," Eleanor announced, her voice resonating with a power no one in that room had heard before. "Allow me to introduce myself properly. I am Federal Judge Eleanor Vance." She paused, letting the weight of the title sink in. "And the evidence I've presented is merely preliminary discovery material for case number 225CR0714, United States versus Sterling et al. An active federal RICO investigation into conspiracy, wire fraud, property destruction, and corruption over which I happen to be presiding." Victoria Sterling stared, her mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish gasping for air. The color drained from her face, leaving her complexion a pasty white beneath her expensive tan. Her carefully constructed world, her empire of petty tyranny and criminal enterprise shattered around her in that single devastating moment. The remote control for the projector slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers and clattered onto the floor. As if on cue, the double doors at the back of the clubhouse burst open. Several figures entered swiftly, men and women wearing jackets clearly identifying them as FBI agents. Their faces were grim professional. Panic flickered in Mark Sterling's eyes, seeing the agents fan out. His instinct for self-preservation kicked in. While all eyes were locked on his wife's stunned paralysis, he made a sudden break for a side emergency exit. He didn't make it 3 steps before 2 agents intercepted him, tackling him to the ground with practiced efficiency. A startled cry went up from some homeowners. Other agents moved directly towards the lectern. "Victoria Sterling," one agent stated clearly, holding up his badge. "You are under arrest." She didn't resist, didn't speak, her eyes wide with disbelief as they gently but firmly handcuffed her hands behind her back. The woman who had wielded power so ruthlessly moments before now looked utterly broken, stripped bare of her authority and arrogance. In the shocked silence that followed, a single distinct sound broke the tension. Agnes Holloway, tears streaming down her face, tears not of sorrow but of profound relief, began to clap. Hesitantly at first, then joined by another neighbor and another. The applause swelled, filling the room. It was the sound of fear breaking, of years of intimidation, dissolving of a community, finally liberated from the shadow of Victoria Sterling's reign. Eleanor stood tall in her robes, a silent observer of the justice finally set in motion. The federal courtroom buzzed with anticipation, a stark contrast to the subdued clubhouse where Victoria Sterling's empire had crumbled. Though Judge Eleanor Vance had recused herself from presiding due to her direct involvement, she watched the proceedings intently from the gallery alongside Agnes Holloway and other Willow Creek residents. Victoria sat at the defendant's table, impeccably dressed but visibly diminished, the arrogance replaced by a brittle tension. The prosecution built its case methodically, brick by damning brick. Isabel Moreno took the stand, her initial nervousness giving way to a quiet, firm resolve as she recounted the financial manipulations Victoria had forced her to perform. Tears welled as she described the threats Victoria made, but her voice didn't waver as she authenticated the USB drive's contents. The spreadsheets tracing the illicit money flow from Sterling Development Group after each suspicious incident. And her testimony provided the crucial link between the fires and financial gain, validating the immense risk she had taken. Frank Rourke followed, presenting his findings with the calm precision of a seasoned investigator. He laid out the timeline of harassment against Eleanor, corroborated by her meticulous logs and security footage snippets. He detailed the discovery of the LLC, its connection to Victoria, and the pattern of acquiring properties under duress. He presented the analysis of the soil sample from Briarwood's foundation, confirming the presence of accelerant traces inconsistent with a simple electrical fire. His testimony connected the dots, transforming suspicious patterns into a coherent narrative of criminal conspiracy. Perhaps the most dramatic moment came when Mark Sterling took the stand. As part of a plea agreement, the former police chief testified against his own wife. His voice was low, devoid of its former menace as he detailed the scheme from the inside. How Victoria identified targets, how he used his contacts to suppress initial inquiries into the earlier fires, how they coordinated with Arthur Kensington, and how the arson at Briarwood House was planned. After Eleanor refused to yield, he avoided Victoria's gaze, focusing instead on the prosecuting attorney, his testimony sealing his wife's fate while securing his own lesser sentence. It was a stark portrait of loyalty, sacrificed for self-preservation. The prosecution also called witnesses Eleanor and Frank had identified from Frank's initial investigation, homeowners who had lost their properties years earlier under similar circumstances. An elderly man described losing irreplaceable family photos in a sudden garage fire, the day after refusing an HOA mandate. A young couple recounted baffling structural citations, appearing immediately after they contested an assessment, forcing them to sell their dream home to Victoria's LLC for a fraction of its worth. Their victim impact statements painted a heartbreaking picture of lives disrupted and dreams destroyed by Victoria's calculated avarice and abuse of power. In closing arguments, the prosecutor summarized the overwhelming evidence: the financial trail, the insider testimony, the pattern of intimidation and destruction, Mark Sterling's confession, and the chilling undercover recording. This wasn't about property values, the prosecutor declared, gesturing towards a stoic Victoria. This was about greed, control, and a callous disregard for the law and the lives of fellow citizens. It was a calculated abuse of power orchestrated for personal gain, hidden behind the veneer of community leadership. The scales of justice, once deliberately tipped by influence and intimidation, were now poised to deliver their verdict. The verdicts came swiftly, decisively. Guilty on all major counts: RICO conspiracy, fraud, arson, witness tampering. Victoria Sterling received a lengthy federal prison sentence, the judge citing the calculated long-term abuse of trust and the profound harm inflicted on multiple victims. Mark Sterling received a reduced sentence due to his cooperation, but still faced significant time behind bars. The other implicated HOA allies received varying sentences based on their involvement. Justice, though slow and hard-won, had finally prevailed. 6 months later, the early autumn sun cast a warm, gentle light on Briarwood House. It stood proud once more, meticulously rebuilt. A testament to resilience, the heritage. Blue trim gleamed freshly painted, a vibrant declaration against the crisp blue sky. On the porch, Eleanor Vance sat in her familiar rocking chair, savoring the aroma of her morning coffee. Below where the ancient lilacs had stood, a bed of hardy azaleas bloomed profusely. Salvaged cuttings Frank had miraculously found protected in a far corner of the yard, now thriving their bright pink and white blossoms, a symbol of tenacious new life. The sound of children's laughter drifted over from the house next door, the sleek modern structure once occupied by the Sterlings. It had been sold as part of the restitution settlement, and now a young family lived there. Their 2 small children were chasing a brightly colored ball across the lawn, their joyful shouts a stark welcome contrast to the tense silence that had once emanated from the property. Eleanor smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through her. The oppressive atmosphere of Willow Creek Estates had lifted. In place of Victoria's punitive HOA, a new informal community association had formed, organized by Agnes Holloway and other residents eager to foster genuine neighborliness. Their first event, a neighborhood block party, was planned for the following weekend to be held right there on the stretch of road connecting Briarwood House and its new neighbors. People stopped by Eleanor's porch now, not with suspicion or fear, but with friendly greetings, offers of surplus garden vegetables, or simply to admire the restored beauty of her home. Eleanor took another sip of coffee, reflecting on the tumultuous journey. The loss of her home had been devastating, a deep wound tearing through layers of memory and heritage. Yet from those ashes, something stronger had emerged. Not just a rebuilt house, but a renewed sense of community and a profound understanding of her own resilience. The fight had been costly, emotionally and physically. But watching the children play next door, feeling the easy camaraderie returning to the street, she knew it had been necessary. She glanced at the small gavel-shaped pen resting on the porch table. Victoria's pen dropped in stunned silence at the HOA meeting, which Eleanor had quietly kept. It served not as a trophy, but as a quiet reminder that power wielded without conscience inevitably crumbles, that justice, even when delayed, can be profoundly restorative, and that sometimes the most powerful act of defiance, the truest victory, lies simply in the quiet, determined beauty of rebuilding. This compelling story offers potent life lessons, applicable far beyond neighborhood disputes. Like Eleanor facing Victoria's escalating pressure, we learn the crucial importance of standing firm on our principles and not dismissing early warning signs of conflict or unfair treatment. Her meticulous documentation reminds us to keep careful records when facing challenges, whether in workplace disputes or personal disagreements. Preparation is power. Eleanor's journey highlights that true strength often lies not in aggression, but in calm resolve and strategic patience. When faced with adversity, don't isolate yourself. Eleanor wisely sought allies like Frank and Isabel, demonstrating the power of building a trusted support network. The story reinforces that while setbacks and even devastating losses like the fire can occur, resilience allows us to rebuild, often creating something stronger and more authentic in the process, just as the community reformed after Victoria's downfall. Remember, facing injustice requires courage, preparation, and often allies. By documenting facts, knowing your rights, seeking support, and acting with integrity, you can navigate difficult situations and emerge not just intact, but empowered, finding strength even in the ashes of adversity.